My 30th birthday was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone, a day when my family would come together as they always had to mark another year of my life with laughter, gifts, and warm wishes. At least, that's what I had thought. Instead, it became the day I realized just how little my family valued me. The day started off normally enough. I had taken the day off work, hoping to spend it with my parents and my younger brother, Daniel. My family wasn't overly sentimental, but birthdays had always been a big deal growing up. My mother loved planning small gatherings. My father would give his usual half-hearted but good-natured speech about how another year means more responsibility, and Daniel, despite his occasional immaturity, had always been there with a teasing comment and a heartfelt gift. So when my mother called me the night before, asking me to come over for a special birthday breakfast, I didn't think twice. I arrived at my parents' house at 9 a.m., expecting balloons, maybe a small cake, and a few thoughtful presents. Instead, the atmosphere felt strangely subdued. My parents sat across from me at the dining table, their expressions unreadable. Daniel was already there too, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. There were no decorations, no sign of a celebration. That's when I first felt the knot of unease in my stomach. "Sit down, sweetheart," my mother said, her voice overly sweet in a way that immediately put me on edge. My father cleared his throat and slid a manila envelope across the table toward me. "Happy birthday," he said flatly. I hesitated before picking it up. There was no card, no gift bag, just a plain envelope. When I opened it, my eyes scanned the legal jargon, my brain struggling to process what I was reading. The house, my house, the one I had lived in for the past 5 years, was no longer mine. My parents had transferred ownership to Daniel. At first I thought there had to be some mistake. Maybe this was a mix-up, a poorly executed joke. "What is this?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Daniel looked down at his hands, avoiding eye contact. My mother sighed, reaching across the table as if to pat my hand, but I pulled away. "Sweetheart, we just thought this made the most sense for the family." "The most sense?" My voice rose. "You gave my house away?" "You've been living there alone," my father said, his tone firm, as if that justified everything. "Daniel is starting a family. He needs a stable place for his future wife and child. You have your career. You can always find another place." I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. It didn't come. They weren't joking. They had unilaterally decided that my brother deserved my home more than I did. And worse, they had done it all behind my back. "Let me get this straight," I said slowly, my fingers gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled. "You transferred my house to Daniel without telling me, because he needs it more?" Daniel finally spoke, though his voice was hesitant. "Look, I didn't ask for this. Mom and Dad thought it was the right thing to do. And honestly, it makes sense. You travel for work all the time. I'm getting married. We need the space." I let out a disbelieving laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, it makes sense. Daniel, I bought that house with my own money. I paid the mortgage, the bills, the repairs, and you think it's fair to just take it from me?" "You didn't buy it," my father cut in, his tone turning cold. "We did. You've been living in it, yes, but technically it was always ours." My stomach dropped. That was a technicality I had never thought would be used against me. Yes, my parents had helped me buy the house years ago, mostly for tax reasons, but I had always assumed it was understood that it was mine. I had covered everything: insurance, maintenance, renovations. But now they were using that technicality to justify stealing it from me. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "This is unbelievable," I said, shaking my head. "You actually think this is okay?" "It's not about fairness," my mother said, her voice turning pleading. "It's about what's best for the family." "Right," I scoffed. "Best for Daniel. And what about me?" "You're successful," my father said, as if that somehow compensated for what they had done. You've always been independent. We knew you could handle this." I was speechless. All these years I had done everything right. I had worked hard, built my career, never asked them for anything beyond what was originally agreed upon. And yet, they had still chosen Daniel over me. "Wow," I whispered, more to myself than to them. "Happy birthday to me, huh?" I turned to leave, but my mother called after me. "Please don't make this a big deal. We're still family." I paused at the door, gripping the handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then I turned back to look at them. My parents, who had just stolen my home, and my brother, who had accepted it without protest. "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter now but laced with steel. "We are, and I'll remember that." I walked out, my heart pounding. The betrayal stung, but something else was growing beneath the pain. Determination. They had taken my house, but they had no idea what I was about to take from them. I drove aimlessly after leaving my parents' house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The betrayal burned in my chest, replaying over and over in my mind. They had taken my home, the place I had spent years building, the place I had poured my money and effort into, without hesitation, without warning, and handed it to Daniel like it was some kind of family heirloom. But I wasn't going to let this slide. I had learned a long time ago that in my family, arguing wouldn't get me anywhere. My parents had always played favorites, even if they never admitted it outright. Daniel was their golden child, the one who always got second chances, the one who could mess up and still have my parents swooping in to fix things. I, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the one who didn't need help, the one they could push aside because they assumed I'd be fine. Well, they were about to learn how wrong they were. As I drove, my mind started working through the situation logically. What they had done was underhanded, but technically legal. The house had always been in their name, and I had trusted that they wouldn't pull something like this. That was my mistake, trusting them. But if they thought I would just roll over and accept it, they clearly didn't know me as well as they thought. I had spent the past 8 years working for my father's company, Harper & Co., a mid-size but highly profitable business that specialized in logistics and supply chain management. While my father was still the official CEO, I was the one who had modernized the company, restructured the financial operations, and expanded our client base. I had built strong relationships with suppliers, handled major accounts, and most importantly, I knew exactly how the company worked, inside and out. Daniel, on the other hand, had never shown any real interest in the business. He had worked there briefly after college but quit within a year, complaining that it was too corporate for him. My parents had always assumed that when the time came, I would take over. But now I wasn't so sure. If they were willing to screw me over when it came to the house, what was stopping them from doing the same with the company? I needed to secure my position before they could pull the rug out from under me again. The first thing I did was call my lawyer, Greg. He had been my attorney for years, handling various contracts and negotiations for me, and I trusted him completely. I explained the situation briefly, how my parents had blindsided me, and how I needed to ensure that my stake in Harper & Co. was untouchable. Greg sighed on the other end of the line. "I can look into the house situation, but if it was in their name, there's not much you can do legally. As for the company, you have shares, right?" "Yes," I said, "but my father still has majority control." "Then that's what we need to focus on," Greg said. "You need leverage. Something that either forces him to hand over control or puts you in a position where he can't push you out." Leverage. That was something I could work with. The next few days were spent quietly gathering information. I had access to the company's financials, and I knew that while we were profitable, there were a few weak points. Contracts that weren't as solid as they should have been, investments that weren't yielding the expected returns. My father had always been old school in his business approach, relying more on instinct than on actual data, and that had led to some questionable decisions. I also started talking to key people in the company, longtime employees, department heads, and shareholders. Many of them respected me far more than they respected my father, simply because I was the one they dealt with on a daily basis. I had built relationships, I had earned their trust, and now I was going to use that trust to my advantage. One of my biggest allies was Ellen Carter, our CFO. She had been with the company for over 20 years, and she was one of the few people who saw the same problems I did. When I approached her about my concerns, she didn't hesitate to confirm what I already suspected. "Your father is stuck in his ways," she said bluntly as we sat in her office. "He doesn't listen to advice, he resists change, and he refuses to acknowledge when he's made a mistake. If this company is going to survive long-term, we need a new leader, someone who actually understands modern business strategies." "And you think that's me?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Ellen gave me a sharp look. "You've been running this place for the past 3 years, even if your father refuses to admit it. The board knows it. The employees know it. The only person who doesn't seem to realize it is him." That was exactly what I needed to hear. Over the next few weeks, I carefully positioned myself to take control. I started acquiring more shares, using personal funds and discreet negotiations to buy out minor stakeholders. I also worked on securing the support of the board, ensuring that when the time came, they would back me over my father. At the same time, I made sure to keep things normal on the surface. I attended family dinners, pretended to be getting over the house situation, and acted like I wasn't planning something much bigger. My parents seemed relieved, thinking that I had accepted their decision and moved on. Even Daniel had the nerve to try and talk to me like nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just stolen my home out from under me. "Hey, I know things were tense," he said one evening when we ran into each other at a company event, "but I hope we can move past it. We're family, right?" I smiled at him, a calm, easy smile that didn't reveal a thing. "Of course," I said smoothly. "We're family." He had no idea what was coming. By the time I was ready to make my move, I had everything lined up. I had secured enough shares to challenge my father's control. I had the board's support, and most importantly, I had gathered enough financial data to prove that my leadership was the only thing keeping the company afloat. When I finally walked into my father's office and told him it was time for him to step down, he laughed at first. "You really think you can take this company from me?" he scoffed. I placed a thick file on his desk. "I don't think, Dad. I know." As he flipped through the documents, his face darkened. Every bad decision, every financial risk, every failing investment, laid out in black and white, and next to it, my solutions, my strategies, my plan for the future of the company. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "No," I said. "You made the mistake when you underestimated me." This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about taking what was rightfully mine. My parents had chosen Daniel over me. They had taken my house. But I was about to take something much bigger. The day I took control of Harper & Co. was a moment I had been preparing for over the last several months. Every move I made, every conversation I had, was part of the strategy to wrestle power away from my father, the very man who had been so quick to take my home from me without even a second thought. What started as a reaction to my family's betrayal had morphed into a calculated campaign for control, a way to finally assert my independence, not just financially, but in every aspect of my life. The final step in my plan was upon me: the annual board meeting. This was where I would make my move. Over the years, my father had always relied on his reputation to secure his place at the helm of the company, but his grip had been slipping for some time. The board had grown increasingly disillusioned with his old-school approach to business. He wasn't open to new ideas, and he resisted any kind of change. The company, once a rising star in the industry, had started to plateau under his leadership. Meanwhile, I had been quietly steering it toward a more profitable, modern direction. The morning of the meeting, I woke up early, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. I had prepared for this day for so long that it felt surreal. My mind was sharp, my nerves steady. I was ready. I dressed in a tailored suit, something powerful yet understated, and drove to the office. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see my father's black SUV already parked in its usual spot, a symbol of his dominance, his control. I took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. This was it, the moment I had worked for. The office was quiet when I walked in. The employees were busy, the hum of phones and computers filling the air, but everything seemed normal, as if nothing was about to change. I nodded to a few familiar faces as I made my way to my father's office. The door was open, and he was sitting at his desk, reviewing some documents. He looked up when I entered, giving me a tight smile. "Ah, there you are. Ready for the big day?" he asked, though his tone was anything but warm. There was always an underlying tension between us, something that had only grown as I became more involved in the company. "Ready as I'll ever be," I replied, my voice calm, betraying nothing of the storm that was brewing inside me. "I'm sure you've prepared your usual presentation," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But just remember, this is my company, and I'm the one who built it." I could hear the pride in his voice, but I knew the truth. He hadn't built this company. We had. My ideas, my strategies, my tireless work behind the scenes, those were what had propelled us to where we were today. He had been too stubborn to see it. "I know, Dad," I said, forcing a smile, "and I respect that, but it's time for something new, time for change." He raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. The quiet tension hung in the air as we made our way to the boardroom. I had already arranged everything. The majority of the board members, those who had seen the company stagnate under my father's leadership, were on my side. Ellen Carter, our CFO, had been instrumental in securing their votes, making sure they understood that my vision for the future was the only way to ensure the company's continued success. When we entered the boardroom, the long table was already filled with the usual faces. Some were familiar, longtime members of the board who had worked with my father for years. Others were newer additions, brought on board during my time at Harper & Co. I could feel their eyes on me as I walked to my seat at the head of the table. My father took his usual spot at the opposite end, exuding a quiet confidence that I knew was about to be shattered. As he settled into his chair, he looked around the room, seemingly oblivious to the shift in the air. He had always assumed that he had the board's loyalty, but that was no longer the case. The meeting began, as it always did, with my father presenting the quarterly financials, discussing the company's performance, and making his usual points about expansion plans. He spoke in his authoritative tone, as if he were still in control, but underneath the surface I could see the cracks. His presentation lacked the usual fire, the usual belief in his own ideas. It felt like he was going through the motions, no longer truly invested in the company's future. I waited for the right moment to make my move. When the conversation shifted to new initiatives and strategies, I seized the opportunity. "I think it's time we take a hard look at the direction this company is headed," I said, my voice firm but measured. "We've been focusing too much on the same old strategies, relying on outdated methods that aren't yielding the results we need. The market has changed, and if we don't adapt, we'll be left behind." The room fell silent. My father's expression faltered, and I could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged in front of the board. "I've been working on a new set of initiatives," I continued, "ones that focus on innovation, efficiency, and modern technology. We need to invest in automation, streamlining our supply chain, and expanding into new markets. We also need to update our client relations strategy. I've spoken with several key clients, and many of them are eager to see us evolve." I could feel the board members' eyes on me as I spoke. They had heard rumors of the changes I had been making behind the scenes, but hearing it all laid out so clearly made it real. I could sense that many of them were leaning in, nodding in agreement. My father's voice broke the silence. "We don't need to change everything," he said, his tone defensive. "Our approach has worked for years. This company was built on tradition, on relationships, on trust. Changing everything now would be a mistake. But I wasn't about to back down. With all due respect, Dad, tradition is important, but it doesn't guarantee success. The world is changing. If we want to survive in this market, we need to be bold. We need to innovate. I've already started laying the groundwork. I've secured partnerships, restructured departments, and most importantly, I've built the team that can take this company to the next level. My father's face was turning red, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He knew that I was right, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He had spent decades building the company on his own terms, and the thought of someone, especially me, taking it from him was something he couldn't accept. At that moment, I knew I had him. "We'll have a vote," I said, my voice calm but unwavering. "The board can decide whether or not they agree with the direction I'm proposing." The board members looked at each other, some hesitant, others resolute. One by one they cast their votes, and I could see the tide turning. When the final tally was read aloud, my heart raced. The majority had voted for me. I had secured the vote. I had taken control. My father sat in stunned silence, unable to process what had just happened. He had lost the company he had built, not because of incompetence, but because of his inability to adapt, his refusal to listen. And the thing that stung the most, the thing that would haunt him forever, was that I had done it without his help. "I guess this is it then," I said, my voice steady. "I'm the new CEO of Harper & Co., effective immediately." My father stood up, his face a mixture of disbelief and rage. "You can't just—" I cut him off. "I already have. This company needs a leader who understands where the world is headed. I've been running it for years now. You were just in the way." I stood up as well, straightening my suit, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over me. It wasn't just about the company. It was about showing my family that I wouldn't be underestimated. They had taken my home, but I had taken their legacy. I walked out of the boardroom with my head held high. I had won. The power had shifted, and I was in control. The days that followed my ascension to the CEO position at Harper & Co. were filled with a combination of triumph, disbelief, and quiet reflection. The enormity of what I had just done was not lost on me, but it didn't stop the adrenaline that surged through my veins every time I sat in my new office, every time I made a decision that would alter the course of the company. I had won. Not only had I claimed control of the company, but I had also taken a significant step toward reclaiming my autonomy, my place in the world, and, perhaps most importantly, my identity. But winning this battle didn't come without consequences. The first call I made after the board vote was to Ellen Carter, our CFO, to thank her for her unwavering support. She had been instrumental in ensuring the vote went in my favor, and I knew I couldn't have pulled this off without her. "You did it," Ellen said when she answered, her voice warm with satisfaction. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had the guts to pull this off in one fell swoop." I chuckled, sitting back in my new chair, feeling the power in the smooth leather beneath me. I had to make my move. Too much was at stake. "Now we need to focus on moving forward, setting the company up for long-term success. We've got a lot of work to do." She laughed softly, the sound laced with genuine excitement. "No doubt about that. But let's take a moment to appreciate what you've accomplished. The old man is out, and the future is yours." I paused for a moment, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city skyline. There was a certain weight to her words that made me realize something. Yes, I had achieved the goal I had set out for myself, but I had done so at a cost. The victory was mine, but the aftermath was something I hadn't fully anticipated. Later that evening, my parents called. They wanted to talk. I had known this moment would come. The confrontation, the fallout, but I still wasn't prepared for how it would feel. My father's voice was cold and measured when he spoke, but I could hear the crack in it, the frustration and disbelief that I had taken everything from him. You think you've won, he said, his voice tight, but you've destroyed everything we've built. The company, the family, you've turned your back on everything that mattered. I could feel the weight of his words, but they didn't affect me the way I thought they would. I had been expecting guilt, anger, resentment, and yet all I felt was nothing. There was no emotional response because, for the first time, I wasn't the one making concessions. I wasn't the one who had to apologize or explain myself. I haven't destroyed anything, I replied calmly. I've saved the company. It was clear that the old way of doing things wasn't working. It wasn't sustainable. I did what needed to be done. I heard a bitter laugh on the other end of the line. And what about the family? You've broken everything between us. You took my company, my legacy. What's next? Are you going to take everything else too? His words stung, but only because I knew they were coming from a place of pride, not love. It was his ego talking, not his heart. He wasn't angry at me for being ambitious or for taking control. He was angry because he hadn't been able to do the same. He was angry because he saw my actions as a rejection of him. You gave me the house, I said quietly. You took that from me without a second thought, and now you're angry that I'm doing the same thing to you? The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear him take a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I didn't mean for it to go like this, he finally said, his voice softening ever so slightly. I thought I was doing what was best for you. I thought giving you the company was the right thing. But now I see that I've lost you. I wasn't sure how to respond. It was all so warped. The notion that he had been trying to help me, when in fact his actions had been self-serving and based entirely on his own vision of success, was laughable. Still, I kept my voice steady. I'm not your project, Dad, I said firmly. I'm not your legacy. I have my own path now, and I'm going to make sure it's one that's worth walking. There was a long pause, and then, finally, he said the words I had known were coming but never quite expected. I'm ashamed of you. The finality of that statement left a bitter taste in my mouth, but I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My actions had already spoken for me. I had made my choice, and there was no going back. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. I spent countless hours in meetings with the board, restructuring the company, laying out a new vision that would ensure Harper & Co.'s future success. I was relentless. I didn't have time for distractions, and I certainly didn't have time for the constant barrage of guilt and anger from my parents. I had been the one to save the company, and now it was time to build something that would outlast us all. But despite my determination, there were moments of doubt. Moments where I questioned if I had done the right thing. I had taken control, but at what cost? Yes, the company was thriving, and yes, my vision was being realized, but at the same time, the rift between me and my family had deepened beyond repair. My parents, once my strongest supporters, had become strangers to me, and Daniel, while he was still living in the house that should have been mine, completely oblivious to the magnitude of what had transpired. One evening, I received an email from Daniel. It was short and to the point. I'm not going to apologize for what happened, but I think you should know that Mom and Dad are not taking this well. They've been talking about selling the company, maybe even buying it back from you. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it. My parents were so consumed by their pride that they were willing to sell the very thing they had built just to spite me. It was a ridiculous notion, one that would never come to fruition, but the fact that they had even considered it spoke volumes about how deep the dysfunction ran. I didn't respond to Daniel. He had nothing to offer me now. A few days later, I called Ellen into my office. I needed someone to bounce ideas off of, someone who could help me see the bigger picture. She had always been a steady presence in my career, and now more than ever, I needed her expertise. "How's everything going on your end?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Ellen gave a small smile. "You've changed the game, that's for sure." The company's on the up and up, profits are higher than we projected, but I can see you're struggling with the family dynamic. I hesitated, then nodded. It's hard, Ellen. I thought that once I had control, everything would fall into place. But it's not just about the business. It's about the people I had to leave behind to get here. My family. I thought I was making the right choice, but I'm starting to wonder if it was worth it. Ellen looked at me, her expression soft but knowing. You did what you had to do. You built something that's going to last. But if you're asking whether it was worth it, that's a question only you can answer. I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. I guess I'll have to live with the consequences. And that was the truth. I had taken the company, I had taken control of my life, but the cost had been high. The family I once knew, the people I had spent my entire life trying to make proud, those relationships were gone, shattered beyond repair. It was a cold realization, one that haunted me in the quiet moments when I found myself sitting alone in my office, staring out at the city that I had conquered but could no longer share with anyone. In the end, I had everything I had ever wanted, the company, the success, the power. But the victory was hollow. No amount of wealth or prestige could replace the loss of the people I had once called family. The road ahead was mine to walk, but I wasn't sure if I had the strength to carry the weight of what I had left behind. And as I sat there, looking out over the city, I understood the true cost of power. Sometimes, the price is higher than you can ever imagine.